However, I will add that their job as a government agency is to say, yes, of course you can do that. What they don't always tell you is how much it will cost to get there. And so that's where getting someone else involved that has some expertise. And yes, to achieve that, these are the pieces that it will take to do that.
Welcome to MeatsPad. In collaboration with the American Meat Science Association, it's a platform dedicated to share breakthrough knowledge that is accessible to the global meat industry. On each episode, you'll have the opportunity to listen and learn from meat specialists and professionals about the whole meat industry. This podcast is brought to you by the U.S. Meat Export Federation,
U.S. Pork,
Ultrasource, equipment and supplies for the meat and food industry.
Hello, meat folks. Welcome back to the MeatsPad podcast. It is your hungry and humble host, Phil Bass, here with a connection from a previous time in my life. Wow, this is sounding odd. Dr. Bob Delmore was my major professor for my master's degree, and has been a longtime friend and colleague of mine. But as he would mention, the smarter and much more good-looking version is Dr. Lynn Delmore, his wife, and I appreciate Dr. Lynn Delmore, Lynn, being a part of the show today with us. Lynn, thanks for joining.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm anxious to be a part of this.
Yeah. Well, don't be too anxious. Just tell me what's on your mind, of course. But the Delmore team is always the first that comes to mind when I'm thinking of food safety. I learned so much from you guys from many years ago, and I continue to learn from you guys. And I know that a day-to-day occurrence for you, Lynn, is to help plants troubleshoot their own systems to just make themselves better as a result. But there's a number of questions that are floating around out there right now. And I think this is very timely, and I believe that you can answer some of those questions. And one being that I get regularly is, I want to become USDA inspected, and we're going to start up a new meat plant. And first thing, of course, I say, are you really, really sure you want to do that? But secondly is, well, let's go through that process, shall we? Things may have changed since the last time I was truly engaged in that world. And so I'd love to get your perspective on, if someone comes up to you and says, I want to become USDA inspected, what's the process? What do we need to know about going into this eyes wide open?
Well, you started with some really good questions. Are you sure you want to do that? And so there are lots of pieces to becoming USDA inspected. And so to your point, we get lots of questions from folks that are brand new. We want to build a plant. We get this question from plants that are existing custom plants or state inspected plants who then want to become under FSIS inspection, Food Safety Inspection Service, which is a division of the USDA. And so people come at it from different directions. The thing that I will always start with is, leave enough time. This is not a quick process. And you just need to plan early. And so we really start with, if it's an existing facility, kind of get USDA out there, have them walk through what you're planning with them, and they can give you some insight. However, I will add that their job as a government agency is to say, yes, of course you can do that. What they don't always tell you is how much it will cost to get there. And so that's where getting someone else involved that has some expertise. And yes, to achieve that, these are the pieces that it will take to do that. So that's if you have kind of an existing plan. If you are starting from scratch, please get someone involved. If you do not have someone involved that understands design of a facility. And so we are often getting calls from plants who kind of went through the design process. They kind of thought they had an idea of what they needed, and then it doesn't necessarily, not that it's not possible, but doesn't make it easy to do what the regulations require you to do. And so if you can design that into your plant, you are better off. So get expert advice early on, earlier than you think. Even if you have to put them on hold for a while, it may be that they can be really helping you in those initial stages from, footprint of and layout of a facility, because that can cause so many problems unto itself. So that's my first thing is get expert advice early on, invite the agency out, become a partner with the agency, let them know what you're doing, where you're heading. They will give you some advice. They will give you some ideas of what their expectations are. The big programmatic things that are required are a requirement for the HACCP plan. And I know we'll talk about HACCP, so Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. The final rule for that came about in 1996. So all FSI suspected plants in 1996 have had that. And that is a large undertaking. And again, this is one of those places where having some expert help is recommended to help you get there, to get the right HACCP plan. There are some resources for small plants put out by FSIS. There's other groups that have resources that can be helpful. So you can kind of take a first stab at it yourself and get some help, get training in this. Even if you were trained long ago, the expectations for HACCP and the regulations have changed. And so making sure you're up to date on that training. So we can talk more about kind of what it takes to put together a HACCP plan. The other big programmatic thing is the sanitation standard operating procedures. So your SSOPs, how you will clean the plant. Both of these programs require you really knowing what the flow of the plant's going to be, what your products are going to be, what your ingredients are going to be, where your raw materials are coming from. And so all of that is a tremendous amount of information that people typically aren't ready to answer if they're starting up from scratch. You know, that takes a while to get that information. But to do these things, you must have that. So you kind of have to layer those things in as you go. If you have an existing facility, you may already have those formulations and process schedules of what you're making on a custom basis that now you're converting under inspection. There is a list of other programs you're going to need in terms of recall programs and food defense and pest management, and you'll have to get letters of guarantees on your potability of your water, your sewage system, all of those types of things. I think those are pretty easily you can gather together. But know that there is a tremendous amount that goes into just getting that initial grant of inspection.
Yeah, well, and these are great lists, and I'm glad that you've mentioned a number of times, get expert advice, get USDA's advice, build a team so that you're going into this thing. You're not going into it alone, and there's definitely a lot of steps that are involved. You've mentioned a number of them. HACCP training is a great beginning so that folks understand what exactly HACCP is and what goes into making sure that that's an effective program. The SSOPs, standard operating procedures, prerequisite programs that you've already mentioned, all those things will go into this process. Now, somebody maybe from the outside looking in, and a lot of the folks that call me up regularly on this topic, all of those things sound very, very intimidating, and they can be if you're unaware of what that means. And that's where bringing the experts in, getting your additional training is important. But what I also tell people is once it's in place, it's paperwork, and we do paperwork all the time. It doesn't matter where you are, what organization you're part of. If you do taxes, you do paperwork for the government, and so this is definitely a little bit more advanced. There's certain guarantees that we need to be bringing about for the public to know that we're doing everything right, and then to keep the inspectors in a content manner, so that knowing that we are doing everything right according to what we have said we're going to do. Just wanted to do a little bit of a recap there, because that's a lot of great information, and you can tell that we're not going to answer everything on this 20-30 minutes that we're going to have together here. This is just the very beginnings, but I think you're going to be a great resource for a lot of folks going forward, as well as other organizations through American Meat Science Association. We have some great resources as well. So you've already mentioned HACCP. I want to go down that road, especially for those maybe who are currently under inspection or are ready to make that leap. What are some things that they need to be aware of, especially if you are currently under inspection and didn't realize possible changes that have occurred recently?
You bet. So I think you're kind of hitting on one of the misunderstandings about the implementation of HACCP under FSIS, and that is that you just have to do this to get your grant of inspection. and then somehow you're done with it. You know, you've
Right.
completed that task. And that is not the case at all. So this is a live, active program that is constantly being updated based on your raw materials, your suppliers, your process, your equipment that's in place. And so every time any of those things change, you have to actually modify your plan. Likewise, I mentioned that this regulation went into place for FSIS in 1996. So what, 20, some years ago. And although it's been in place for that long, the expectations from the agency itself are constantly changing. So the expectation changes. The regulation itself hasn't changed, but how it's implemented and what they expect to see has continually changed and has built on itself for improvement of food safety. So we are at a better place now than we were when this regulation was first put in place. But you just have to recognize this is ongoing. So it's not a one HACCP class. I learned my 7 principles, I'm done. We highly encourage people to come back on a regular basis. And whether it be repeating a class that's the principles of HACCP, learning about the 7 principles, or an advanced HACCP class, but something where you're getting, hey, this is the nuance now of the wording that the agency likes to see. Or if you're still using this wording, they're going to start to question you, or they don't like seeing this particular resource. So validation has been one of the pieces that have changed tremendously of what their expectation of how you validate your HACCP plans. And so you will need to validate a HACCP plan whenever you start a new HACCP plan. Again, when your product changes, you have to revalidate. And then you're going to go through a reassessment at least annually to make sure that your programs are still controlling your hazards of concern. So if I can tell you way back when, in early regulatory HACCP plans, we might have written a microbial hazard, a biological hazard was bacteria. I even saw some HACCP plans that said germs. Back in the day, which was a Tuesday, by the way.
Yeah, right. You're saying we've come a long way, is it?
We've come a long way. And so we want to see, the specific organism of concern, E. coli, O157H7, Salmonella species, Listeria monocytogenes. But more than that, now we want to see leading into, what am I concerned about? Am I concerned about the presence or absence of E. coli 157H7? In which case I'm going to apply some heat or some acid or something to actually kill that organism. Or am I concerned about the potential growth of that organism, in which case I'm going to implement cold chain management. And so these are different controls based on whether I'm concerned about the presence or the growth of that organism. Likewise, when we get into some spore forming organisms, we can talk about spore germination and the risk of that, or toxin production. And each of these have different controls. And so to just say, I'm going to control E. coli by keeping it cold, only controls the growth. And so we've got to get past that. And this is one of the areas in the more modern HACCP plans that's been a huge change, is this layers of detail that have gone into. But truly, it makes sense when we talk about how do I control? I have to know, what am I controlling? Growth, presence, spore germination, etc. Likewise, we've seen a huge change in the agency's expectations about the detail put into monitoring of HACCP plan, or monitoring of critical control points. And so you have a critical control point, you say, I'm going to cook this product to 165, and they say, great. And you say, how are you going to do that? And I'm going to go back in the day, I might have said, I'm going to, because you do this as what and how and when and who's going to do it. And I might say, I'm going to monitor temperature. How am I going to do it? With a thermometer. When am I going to do it? Hourly, and who? The QA. And that's all. I don't know, is that 8 words, 10 words, whatever that was? That's all we would say in these 4 columns of monitoring. And now the expectation is this internal temperature of the product. Is this external temperature of the product? Is it room temperature? Is it cooler temperature? What temperature are we actually talking about? And then when we get to the how, this is a paragraph. This is, not truly an SOP, but getting towards that. So I'm getting in the geometric center of the kettle, or the top, middle, and bottom row of an oven rack, and I'm taken from the cold spot of the oven. And so there's a tremendous amount of detail that goes into that. When we get to frequency now, again, we're still looking at could be, within a production hour. There's some nuances in the wordings there. And then who, we always say, please don't have it just be Phil Bass. Although Phil's really good, he may not be there that day. And so make sure that you've got somebody else trained to do that job and call that out, a job task and their trained designee. And so then that allows, everybody to be part of it. So we're seeing those types of changes. We're constantly going into facilities and helping them develop to the next level their plans, because some plans have not been updated as frequent as they probably should be.
The mission of USMEF is to increase the value and profitability of the U.S. beef, pork, and lamb industries by enhancing demand for their products in export markets through a dynamic partnership of all stakeholders. Simply put, USMEF is putting U.S. meat on the world's table.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and this is that ounce of prevention bit. If you are looking at the HACCP plan as a living document, and I'm glad you said that, because it is something that we need to continue to revisit. It's not a one and done scenario. But if you're looking at it as that living document and working with others in the industry to continue to get better at your food safety systems, it shouldn't be a great undertaking to make these changes. It's just, we have to be more critical as to how we're making the assessments as to what needs to be done, right? So and I think that's really fascinating. This is actually a lot of news to me. It's been a while since I've spent much time in the food safety side of things. I hang out in the quality and eating part of it all, but yeah, there's a lot more detail, but it's clearly a scientific process that's leading a lot of this. And some of the research that you've done in the past that a lot of your team members have been a part of. And then another thing too that you've mentioned was there's definitely not a one size fits all category here. This is, what is it that you're doing, and what are the multiple things that you may be doing in that one facility, and each one of those processes need to have their own plan in place. So.
That's such a good point. And so often plants will think, oh, I know my buddy has a plant like this in Idaho, and so I can just use their HACCP plan. It'll be fine. Yeah. I'll just plug it right in. Yeah. And that's not the case. And so we each have different hazards based on our own flows, our own experiences, our own data that says there. So we have to make sure that they are specific to a location. Although certainly you could start with a format. Likewise, the agency in their small plant guidance has some model HACCP plans. The thing I would say is anything kind of written like that becomes antiquated really quickly. And so even their model plans, I feel like, aren't meeting the current expectations in several areas. And so that's that keeping current. And I can't, you stressed, American Meat Science Association, trade associations, university extension groups that have roundtables for HACCP and food safety, any updated training. You have to stay current, reaching out. So you have to proactively be looking for these opportunities to learn more. So that's, I can't stress that enough. Be involved in your trade associations. And have somebody that you can call and ask these questions to. If it's not a consultant, it's a trade association, you can layer those out. There's, companies that have whole food safety firms, law firms on retainer to support some of their issues, but staying on top of it. It's a bigger task than you think.
Yeah, it is. It certainly is. Yeah. And it's very important to consider having, if you're a small plant, having a person that is designated this is their primary task, is making sure that all of this is being done correctly, and that we're following the protocols, that the paperwork's getting done, and then to give perspective for those smaller plants, there's larger facilities that have entire armies devoted to making sure that everything is going along the right way. And this is not at all a trivial thing that the government is just making you do because the government wants to make you do things. This is because of food safety. We can get into the whole history of things. That's for another discussion for another day. But there's a lot of folks that have can recall what led up to the necessity of this process and programs to be in place, and it's for it's the right thing to do. It's the reason why we can boast having the safest food supply in the world. I strongly believe, because of the foundation of HACCP that we have here in the United States, in North America. Any thoughts on what we might need to be thinking about for the near future? I think you have already addressed kind of a lot of what folks need to be considering as to going forward. If you already have a HACCP plan in place and maybe you haven't reviewed it in a while, we need to be more precise with what it is that we're talking about, so that we don't get ourselves in trouble later on after a higher up from FSIS comes in and has that discussion. For folks that are considering going into it, just do it right the first time, and then we don't have to worry so much about it. Be precise. Don't be too general. Be precise in what you're going to say. But any other thoughts going forward that we might need to be considering? And I know you don't have your crystal ball in front of you, but any thoughts are always welcome.
Well, as you and I've said, it is a dynamic program, and the expectations are constantly updated. The best practices throughout our industry are constantly being updated. And as we do that, we continue, you bring up the science, this is for food safety. We continue to identify potentially new hazards. And from the regulatory side, we look at some of the known existing organisms that may be actually declared adulterants in the future. And so kind of watching what is happening, both with new identification. I will tell you, I had, worked with some folks at one point in time that, looked at E. coli 157H7 would not survive in an acidic environment. And then lo and behold, we have our first outbreak and recall associated with, semi-dry salamis. And in fact, we found that it would survive, that organism would survive in those conditions. So being aware of what's happening in the industry around you, I always tell people, what are your friends and what's happening with your friends and neighbors? If they've had something happen in their product and you make a similar product, boy, you better be taking a hard look to see if there's maybe an opportunity in your program to have that same issue. So constantly being aware of what's new, what's coming. I certainly can say allergens is not something 27 years ago when this started was on the radar at all. And so making sure that you're meeting the expectations from an allergen standpoint, that is considered a chemical hazard within your HACCP plan. So knowing and watching those. So just this year, there have historically been 8 allergens in the U.S. and this year sesame was added to that list. And so again, a change. If you are exporting product, the expectation is that you actually meet all of the allergen requirements for the U.S. and to the country that you're exporting to. So you have to be familiar with all of those types of things. So, just watching that, again, what the agency will declare an adulterant from a regulatory standpoint. Most of us are watching that pretty darn close to see what might happen. The last thing I'm going to say is the expectations and best practices around how we handle ready to eat, so fully cooked, ready to eat items continues to drive forward. So Listeria monocytogenes is typically our organism of concern there. And it's too often people say, well, I've never gotten sick of it. This is a high mortality organism, like 1 in 6 people die from Listeria. So the fact that it has low incidence is fantastic. Right. But we have to, as an industry, continue to control that so that we don't see an increase in those. So yeah, it's hard to say what are the new things. If I look at recall data, I would say, allergens are typically the #1 cause of recalls, and mostly because of mislabeling. We just don't get the right label on the package for various reasons. And then we have seen an increase in foreign objects and recalls for foreign objects. So, continuing to watch what the agency will do there. They're certainly looking at consumer complaint data at this point in time to make sure that you are responding and reacting appropriately when you get consumer complaints in. So those are the, I spend most of my time looking at organisms and looking at new technologies to control them. So whether they can survive in a more acidic environment than we thought, or there's this new acid or new treatment, or I had a plant the other day, they were using an acid treatment on the carcass. And what they didn't realize is they were applying that acid treatment immediately after a hot water rinse. And so they were diluting out their acid to, really being ineffective. And I said, the agency will actually allow you to, put a higher concentration of acid in and then measure at the drip. And, they just didn't know. And so that's that keeping current, that exactly what we found, that if we're applying it too soon, we just dilute it out and then we lose all the efficacy of it. So
Yeah.
those kinds of things.
Well, that's where folks like you who have devoted themselves to making sure that we can stay in business, but then also making sure that the food continues to be safe is that's where we applaud you and your team. And I know you have a very robust team that really has a lot of experience in the business. If you don't mind, as we land this plane, so to say, we like to ask pretty much all of our guests, how did you get to where you are today? How did you become Dr. Lynn Delmore and what you're doing these days?
That's not always a short answer.
That's all right.
I'll try to keep it brief. So I went through my young years working in 4-H and livestock, and thought that I wanted to be involved in animal agriculture. And the only true position I knew of at that point in time that worked with animals was a veterinarian. And so I spent most of my young life saying, I want to be a veterinarian, I want to be a veterinarian. And then I actually got to a community college and had the opportunity to take my first meat science class and saw the conversion of a live animal. In this case, it was a steer, to a carcass, and then, fabricate out into meat cuts. And I went, yes, this is what I've been trying to, when I listen to judges in a 4-H ring, county fair tell me about the animal, I hadn't seen the carcass. I hadn't put all the pieces together. So big light bulb goes off over my head. And I, at that point in time, like literally switched and said, I want to be a meat scientist, and, changed my major and went to school for meat science for, 3 degrees. It was at that point, I was really looking at meat processing. I spent most of my time, really working on meat processing. And the Jack in the Box incident had just occurred when I was starting in my PhD program, and I had the opportunity to work in the food safety space. And so I think I once had said I had a micro class that I liked, and that was it. You're the food safety person now. and I'm grateful for that. I'm a food safety professional. If someone says, what do you do? I'm a food safety professional. I'm proud to be in that space. Kind of went from there and had the opportunity. I worked in industry and have been a consultant now for 20 years and been able to work across FDA and FSIS inspected facilities and state inspected facilities, and even some public health inspected facilities. And it's been a great journey for me.
Yeah. And also a part-time faculty at Colorado State University. Is that right?
That is correct, where I teach. Guess what? The HACCP class.
No kidding. No, I mean, I think that's fantastic. And folks, that, if you don't know all of the history that was just mentioned here, it's definitely something that's worth reviewing in the future. The fact that we have someone here who was essentially on the front lines when the thing that caused HACCP to become mandatory happened, and that means you have you've seen how this has progressed from essentially the beginning of the modern version of what we have right now, and that's pretty cool. It's really neat to be able to gain some knowledge from you and have you here as a guest, and hopefully if we have any other thoughts or topics out there from our listeners, be happy to reach back out to Dr. Lynn Delmore, Dr. Bob Delmore if we need to as well, and what a great team. So thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll connect again soon.
Fantastic. Thank you all.